Welcome to The Shadow Knows, a podcast where we journey into the depths of our psyche, mystery, and transformation. Hi, I'm Klara.
And I'm Maureen, and together we'll explore the hidden forces that shape our lives, relationships, and our collective story.
And for today's episode, and since Halloween is just around the corner, we thought we'd explore its original purpose and our roots. From mask and shadow to the history of witches, and I'll briefly explore some Czech traditions. I like how both of you suddenly got quiet.
Hi, I'll briefly explore the Celtic roots to the Christian adaptations and how these traditions made their way in America.
And finally, our returning guest, James Frazier, Jungian coach, holotropic, and Neo-Shamanic Breathwork Facilitator, will join us to look at all of these through Jungian lens, exploring how continuing these rituals still impacts our culture today.
You know, when we talk about Halloween, most people think of candy and they think of costumes and maybe a few spooky ghosts, but here's the plot twist. The name Halloween actually comes straight from the church. So those plastic skeletons and those pumpkin spice lattes, All Hallows Eve, the vigil before All Saints Day on November 1st, where people prayed for souls. So in the early Catholic tradition, vigils were sacred nights of prayer and preparation before the feast day took root. All Hallows Eve was meant as a holy evening to honor the saints who have gone before us. Now, the timing here wasn't random. The church placed All Saints Day right around the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, which marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of winter. Samhain was a time when people believed that the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, and they'd light bonfires and wear masks to protect themselves from wandering spirits. So when Christianity spread through the Celtic regions, the church didn't erase those customs. I think it was rather ingenious of them. They transformed them. I know it feels a little bit sneaky, like the church quietly said, "Nice bonfire festival you got going there. Mind if we make it about saints and some salvation?" The truth is, it was less about trickery and more about transformation. Early Christians often took those local traditions, those harvest festivals, they infused them with the sacred. Bonfires became a symbol of Christ's light conquering darkness instead of fearing the dead. And then Catholics began praying for them. That's how All Souls Day, November 2nd, was added, to remember and pray for those in purgatory. For those of you who aren't familiar with Catholic tradition, as sort of a final polishing of souls, maybe heaven's waiting room where you check in with baggage and check out all shiny and forgiven. By the 14th century, poor people, especially children, and parts of Ireland would go door to door offering prayers for souls of the dead in exchange for small cakes. They were called soul cakes. It's pretty cool. The cakes were tokens of thanks and prayers meant to help the souls in purgatory. So Halloween at its core grew out of Catholic theology. It was about the communion of saints. While today's Halloween has taken a little bit more of a playful tone, its roots are really about remembering that we're all part of one great family. Children would dress in costumes or disguises and go door to door performing little songs, jokes, or tricks in exchange for food or coins. The costumes often represented spirits and saints in a way of blending superstition with faith. And people dressed up either to honor or ward off wandering spirits believed to roam on All Hallows Eve. And then the arrival, which is one of my favorite parts of this, when Scottish immigrants and the Irish as well came to the United States in the 19th century, they brought these traditions with them. Early American Halloween celebrations, community gatherings had games, storytelling, and a little bit of mischief. So costumes really became very popular in the 1800s. By the 1920s and the 1930s, it was popularized as a way of making the holiday more neighborly and praying for souls. And it was then later replaced by candy.
Wow, Maureen, that was so
Great.
informative.
Thank you.
You pretty much packed it all in for me as well, because I was going to share a little bit of a tradition from my own country, from the old Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic. I remember coming to this country, United States, back in 1998, and I was just bedazzled. I had no idea what's going on. I suddenly see all people dressing up and what is going on, and lots of sugar, lots of candy, and trick-or-treating, and what is all of that? I had no idea about the customs that this country has around Halloween. What I only remember was actually All Saints tradition, All Souls Days, I should say. But in Czech, we call it dušičky. In a literal translation, it means the little soul. And the tradition was that we would either go on November 1st in the evening or on November 2nd in the morning as a family, and remember my grandparents taking me to the graves and to the cemetery of our ancestor. And being a little kid, I always took it as very gloomy and even scared experience. But just to see then walking out and see every single grave being lit up by a single candle was just absolutely memorable. And I can still remember all these graves, just lines and lines of candles just being lit up, and it was very, very striking. And at that time I didn't really connect anything, especially when it comes to Jungian work and Jungian psychology. Always this eerie feel as a kid, of course, being in a cemetery, being very close to death, being very close to almost the realization of mortality. And that kind of it was a tradition, and it was something that we would do every year. We also believed that on that day the veil between these two worlds is very thin. We would pray for those souls so they can be remembered. So it's the tradition I found. It's very similar to the celebration, the Dia de la Muerte, very similar into that tradition. So that's just my wanted to add to this topic. This is how we celebrate it in my country.
That was beautiful. I loved it. Thank you.
So shall we head on the questions?
Let's do that.
So, James, for listeners who might not be familiar, can you give a quick overview of what a Jungian lens is and how it relates to culture rituals like Halloween?
Sure, I'll give it a stab. If you take any great thinker like some of the giants of psychology, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, when we say, what are you doing when you're looking at something through a Jungian lens? What it means is we're taking the insights, the model, the sensibilities of that particular school of psychology and applying it to our observations about a given phenomenon. So there's the Freudian take on a certain thing. There would be the Adlerian take. We could go into philosophy. In other words, it's almost like putting on a pair of glasses and you start to see different things because of the shape of the glasses. When we say look through a Jungian lens, there's some big things that one should keep in mind. Jung's work is always concerned with connecting to the unconscious. He was certainly not the first one to discover the unconscious. We actually might give that title to Franz Mesmer, but he was the one in my mind who has done the deepest level work. Even today, his work just is gigantic. Jung is always concerned with the approach to the numinous, the sacred, and that for him is an exploration of the unconscious. Of course, the unconscious also contains the thing that we're talking about here so often is the shadow. It's everything that it is to be human, but a Jungian lens causes one to look at things not just literally, but symbolically. And this is kind of a problem for us in the modern world because we've elevated rationality to a kind of godhood and we've lost the symbolic abilities. Despite whatever you might feel about the Catholic Church, you have to admire them for their ability with symbol and ritual. They absolutely have a genius about it. And they have carried it forward all these times. But a Jungian view of, say, Halloween would be it's a celebration. Well, it started with celebration of harvest, which is obviously a big thing, but also that's the same time that we're about to go into winter. So it's a recognition of the cycles of nature. It's a time of introversion. It's a time of death. All the leaves fall. Everything goes into hibernation. And then another group comes along and dominates that particular part of the world, and they reframe that into their particular model, and that would be the Catholic Church taking over those, quite rightly. If you have people who've been doing something for centuries, the best strategy is not to try to wipe it out, but simply reinterpret it. I would argue that's actually what we all should be doing, is continually reinterpreting these things. But then if you see its various transformations and manifestations, in this case, to the Catholic Church container around All Souls Day and All Saints Day, And then it becomes more secularized, and that also tracks with our culture. Our culture is much more sacral than it is religious, even though in America we have more churches than any place else in the world. But a Jungian would look at that whole thing and say, what is common about all that? What is in all of that even though they've transformed and called it different names and doing different things, is there a pattern that's going on here? And is there something related to the deep psyche? So that's the first thing about a Jungian sensibility. The other thing is that Jung totally respected the psyche as being objective. He did not believe the psyche was a product of the brain. And so there is the objective psyche and even the archetypal psyche. So what a Jungian would be doing would be looking at all these different celebrations and asking themselves, how is this participating in an archetypal drama? How is this participating in any kind of transformation of the person who's participating in it? Now, admittedly, huge numbers of people participate in rituals and practices of ceremony, particularly who don't have any connection to what they actually mean. And yet, on some deeper level, perhaps there's some benefit to doing it that way. That's why people keep doing it. And why do adults dress up? And you can say, well, it's a good excuse to go have a cocktail party and everybody dresses up in their outrageous outfits. Well, that may be true, but I'll bet there's something else going on there. And what a Jungian would say is this connected to our innate need to connect to shadow, to at least one time in the year have a place where people are allowed to sort of act it out. And so people dress up. In my day, the kids anyway, it was much more the sort of traditional witches and goblins and devils and things like that. Today, it's kind of gotten, everything, and it's a lot of political stuff. And so it's getting watered down in some sense. But I think that would be the one thing I would say about the Jungian sensibility of seeing this as part of a barely conscious or even unconscious process, which is actually an attempt at dealing with balancing the forces within the psyche.
I think that's pretty cool. I'm going to go ahead then and just ask, why do you think Halloween has such a strong pull on our imagination, even today?
Well, my knee-jerk reaction is to say it's the one holiday where we're allowed, at least in some level, to act out the shadow, to touch on those dangerous aspects of ourselves that have likely been repressed. And you can see it in the choices that people make in their costumes. In our work, we do a lot of shadow work, and one of our big, huge workshop pieces is we do a mask making process. And it's one of the most powerful parts of our work, where people get to put on that persona, either take it on or sort of let it out. You might see somebody, for example, who's tremendously shy normally, and they put on a king's outfit, which kind of makes them the center of the attention in the room. Or they put on a disguise like Elvis Presley, who's, it's just a place where we can safely kind of touch the darkness, and we sort of disable the previous medieval dangerous part around it by making it fun. But that may also be our kind of defense mechanism about the fact that we could potentially actually be tapping into our own shadow. And of course, that is what separates celebration of Halloween from something like doing a mask making shadow work, where you're clearly focused on doing that. You're willing to bring up your shadow. But I think it's a kind of really interesting cultural phenomenon. So that may be some incentive for it as well. But it's just one of those holidays that typically always takes place at night. Generally, people don't go trick-or-treating. Maybe in the modern times they have, but it was always done at night. And you had kids walking around with candles, so there's that aspect of it, which relates back to the fire ceremonies. I loved the piece that you shared about children going around and offering prayers and getting rewarded for it. And then that turns into a little bit more devilish, but playful devilish. It's like, if you don't want to get your house egged, you better fork up some candy, right? And of course, we even acted that out. And that's what Carnival and these kind of workshops do. They allow people to temporarily open the door, but open the door symbolically to the darkness, and that being the shadow.
So James, Halloween is all about masks and costumes. And from a Jungian standpoint, what can masks teach us about the shadow side of ourselves?
The simple answer is that they allow us to bring something from the unconscious and put it on as our persona. So we sort of safely can take on those qualities without actually taking on those qualities. Masks originally were seen as ways to frighten off evil spirits, as well as to embody, for example, if you were an ancient primitive hunter-gatherer tribe and you were going out hunting antelope, you might do a ritual dance and all the men would put on an antelope mask because they wanted to take on the qualities of the antelope, and that would give them better insights to the behavior of the antelope and then increase their success in hunt. In the carnival, it's even more profound, especially like you still find in Switzerland, where they spend all year making these elaborate masks, because people can take on these qualities and play act them in a safe way. So it's like letting a shadow out of the cage for a little bit, and we get to hide behind that and pretend to do that. If you look at even ancient masks, and particularly masks like you find it still to this day in New Guinea and among the males and initiatory practices, these are elaborate masks. And some of them are terrifying and frightening, and some are funny and warm. And so it allows us to bring this material, albeit possibly unconsciously, to the forefront. So we're sort of safely able to embody or allow that shadow out in a safe, controlled way.
It is significant that many of these traditions involve confronting fear or pretending to be something else. Would you like to unpack that just a little more?
Well, the first thing that comes up for me is that this is very, very, very difficult for us moderns to even grasp. But fear and danger associated with nighttime for an ancient person would have been radically different than ours. For one thing, there's no electric lights, there's no flashlights, and many of the predators are nocturnal. So your chances of getting attacked by a predator are greatly increased at nighttime. The daytime, the sun is there. It's like the ego consciousness. Everything is bright. You can see everything. Everything is well defined. When you go into the night, you're sort of opening the door into the unconscious. First of all, in the form of projection, and then secondly, in these products that the unconscious produces called dreams. So almost universally, you find a sensibility that nighttime is really dangerous. I think that's partly what the fire ceremonies are about, is to ward off all those evil spirits that could come in the night. For a very primitive man, pre-language, the nighttime is far more dangerous than the daytime. So you get this sensibility that, you have to do things. So you give sacrifices to the not so nice spirits at nighttime. And for example, if you get into a place where there is no light, after about 3 days, you will be hallucinating like crazy without any drugs at all. Just the natural projection process. So much of that was built into the initiatory practices.
Okay, well, what I wanted to ask James, because as I was thinking about sharing my tradition from my country, there's always there was this daunting going to the graves, right, and remembering the ancestors and paying a respect to them. How would you look at that aspect of the tradition through a Jungian lens?
Well, this sort of links to the darkness kind of thing, because in death there is a kind of darkness. We don't normally have contact with the dead, although in many of these ancient cultures, these kinds of celebrations were potentially places where people at least could honor their dead, if not actually believe that they communed with their dead. Now, again, we could do a psychological treatment on that and say, well, okay, so Uncle Fred appeared to you on Halloween. Is that really Uncle Fred, actually Uncle Fred the ego, because he's been dead for 40 years? Or is that your image of Uncle Fred getting married to some psychic material, which would be my position? Graveyards are a very, very interesting place, because they're the place used to be seen as ruled by Hermes. And Hermes is the god, the trickster god, but also the one that takes the souls to the land of the dead. You have to cross the river Styx, and you have to put 2 coins in your eyes to pay the bargeman to get you across. And even the tombstones that we now have are actually harking back to an earlier time when they buried someone. They would pile up rocks, and that was seen as a tribute to the god Hermes. So they were called herms. And eventually that progressed and developed into the actual cutting of stone and the engraving of stone and a kind of permanence. So when you go to a graveyard, you may vaguely have Uncle Fred in your memory, but there's the place where you put the body in, and Uncle Fred is there, and it says it right on the tombstone, and people have brought memorials there. And so it's long been a place where we're sort of, again, symbolically trying to touch these two worlds. Under normal circumstances, they're very, very apart. And I would say in non-ordinary states of consciousness, people often have experiences where they meet ancestors. And you have whole tribes and or cultural organizations around an almost worship of the ancestor. The ancestor is still alive, but just kind of wandering among us. And you think, well, that's really weird. Well, no, it's not. I mean, think about the Christian tradition. Presumably, there are angels walking around all the time. So that was sort of the idea, was that the dead were around, but you also honored them. You paid attention to them. Even William Faulkner is credited with saying, the past is never dead. Hell is not even past, meaning that all these things are still part of our psyche. And so the Mexican Day of the Dead, very, very much linked to this type of thing, of honoring the ancestors. Catholic Church just put their particular frame on it, but it's actually the same thing. It's you're honoring the saints and you're honoring the souls. The graveyard, the nighttime, the spooks, the spirits, the frightening, the haunted houses, all that is all part of the paranormal that we don't fully understand. So it's the world of the nighttime. And normally we're asleep. But in the ancient world, you were much more vulnerable, as I said earlier. So nighttime was much more terrorizing. This is why there's so much emphasis on sunset and sunrise, because in the ancient world, there's no flipping a switch. Sun goes down, you can't see very well unless it's a full moon. Then it's still very vague. But when the sun comes up, wow, now you have gloriously been given another day of light. And that's why there's all this emphasis on the religious aspects of light and darkness, and even in Jungian psychology, of ego level consciousness and the unconscious itself, or the archetypal unconscious.
Often the colors orange and black are associated with Halloween. I'm just wondering if in the Celtic fire rituals, perhaps like you have the orange glow of the fire with the backdrop of the night, and then how those fire rituals translate psychologically or with a Jungian lens for us today.
I'm not sure I could really make that case, but that certainly wouldn't surprise me. And again, looking at things symbolically, which is what a Jungian lens allows you to do. You look at the literal and then you look at what does that symbolize. And of course, part of the flame of a fire, depending on the wood that you use, is orange. Part of it's yellow and part of it's slightly blue, but you could clearly see that at the contrast between, particularly looking at a fire some distance away, it might be more orangish. But there's another thing that pops in my mind. This holiday is when we harvest what? Pumpkins. What color are they? Orange. And pumpkins were a food, they were a food source. Pumpkin seeds, great food source. So it's highly likely that lots of people grew pumpkins. You don't want to get too hung up on the literal, but you kind of go, oh, and what would that trigger inside the psyche? The contrast of light and dark. So I wouldn't have any problem with that at all.
So the last question, James, would be, do you see any recurring archetypes in Halloween traditions like witches, ghosts, or monsters that reflect something deeper in the human psyche?
Yes, well, just a projection of something being monstrous or frightening or terrifying. We see this in dreams all the time. And often in dreams, the psyche is throwing up something that has that effect, like you're being chased by a motorcycle gang with chains and they're out to kill you. Well, often that's kind of showing you what the shadow is and how the ego is repulsed and afraid and terrified of the shadow. So typically it gets projected out. So when we have monsters out in front of us, it's often because we have monsters inside us from the ego's point of view. Now, there is shadow, and as we've talked about, each one of these archetypes has a shadow. There are certain things that show up so frequently, you have to ask yourself if this is not one of the favorite clothing of a particular archetype. The witch is a particularly interesting one because much like the dragon, the witch has double connotations. and I won't go into it, but only briefly mention it. We had a flowering in the 12th century, 11th century, that could have led to a balance of the masculine and the feminine. It included things like the Grail romances. It included the Gothic cathedrals, the rise of the cult of Mary, where suddenly there was a great interest in Mary. And from what I can see, the Catholic Church wasn't all that thrilled about it at first, but it was so popular, they basically had to acquiesce. And so now Mary is a huge part of Catholic Church, which is a kind of back door of the feminine coming in. But at any rate, there was also an equal reaction, and the equal reaction was a repression of the feminine. And it happened in the so-called burning times. And this is where there was a witch hysteria. And you could be accused of a witch. Anybody could accuse you of witch, and it was not like our current legal system. You were guilty until proven innocent. And sometimes the proving innocence resulted in your death. So yes, you died, but you proved you weren't a witch. It was really crazy kind of stuff. And so there was this really dark repression. So with the witch, we have two images. One would be the seer type woman, the medial woman in Tony Wolf's model, the magician woman. Maybe she was a loner, maybe she never married, maybe she was a widower, but she had special skills. She knew about herbs, she knew about women's health, for example, when no male doctor could even look at a woman. They had to do it with models, but female could do it. But they were carriers of wisdom, often folk and nature wisdom. What were the healing plants? And then there was the other side of it where they got falsely accused of being working for the devil, basically. I mean, it was like, okay, well, they're the devil's angel, so to speak. And so, again, you could be accused of being a witch, and then it was a great amount of financial stuff around all this because there was a charge to arrest the witch, there was a charge to transport the witch, there was a charge to try the witch, and if she was found guilty and either proved her innocence by drowning, or she didn't prove her innocence and she was a witch and she got burned at the stake. Either way, her property became somebody's free of charge. So there was a lot of that kind of evil going on as well. But I'm trying to say you get two manifestations of this. One is the best example of this, of course, is the Wizard of Oz, where you have the Wicked Witch of the West, who Dorothy kills when she lands in Oz, and then you have Glinda. So you split it. Well, that's a typical archetypal thing. Every archetype has the shadow. But for something like the witch, I would relate it to the medial woman. And of course, people who can have great intuitions and insights and know things that other people don't know, it's really easy to project onto them either that they are supernatural in their powers or that they're somehow evil, because that's how they got these gifts. You even see it in the modern day world where, as allusion to one of the Mississippi Delta blues guitarists, Robert Johnson, who claimed he sold his soul to the devil to learn how to play the guitar. And then later, when Led Zeppelin burst on the scene in the 1970s, they were so good that there were a lot of people that started spreading that kind of rumor that they were probably sold their soul to the devils. That's why they were so successful. Well, this goes back to Faust. I mean, there are all sorts of interplays. The archetype of the monster in general, or even in death in general, would be a shadow projection. And then there's also zombies, kind of a more modern phenomenon, although go back in history and find examples of the living dead. Well, that's a powerful metaphor for unconsciousness. It's a powerful metaphor for you not knowing your own psyche, that there are parts in your psyche that they might as well be dead, but somehow they're not dead. They're still there. They reside in the form of a complex, say, for example, and they're often terrifying. And then we water them down and we play with them and make them playful. And so now it's a funny slang, Everybody's, are you preparing for the zombie apocalypse? And everybody thinks it's funny. But, Michael Jackson made millions of dollars off of one record about dancing zombies. So I would look at all these things as possible projections and metaphors of archetypes, and at least representations of those archetypes.
The costumes and masks shifted from pagan disguises to playful or maybe symbolic representations, and, like the ritual that we have here of trick-or-treating, dressing up. It serves a purpose, right? A deeper purpose that people are unconscious of.
Well, I think it does. I'm very much in a similar way, the way I feel about Carnival. And the original ones, like that happens in New Orleans with Mardi Gras, although that's more or less degenerated into totally secular in the sense that it's a kind of a sexual license. Now, that is part of the original carnivals. Women get to show their breasts, and the whole collection of beads. And so there's a kind of licensure that happens with that. And also a lot of drunken revelry. Well, if you drink a lot, you're going to be in a non-ordinary state of consciousness. But I think the costumes, even if most people aren't thinking about it this way in a conscious way, they allow us to return to childhood. And that sounds weird, but if you think about childhood, one of the distinguishing features of childhood is that we knew how to play. I spent endless hours killing Nazi Germans when I was a child in my army outfit. And I didn't like John Wayne, I liked Steve McQueen. But I was Steve McQueen on a regular basis on Saturday afternoons. And so it's related to the lover archetype, which we'll talk about in some future session, hopefully, in the sense that it gives people the permission to play and display. We should be able to just do this without a costume, but the costume kind of gives us a buffer in the same way that a persona does. So you could say, well, yeah, in my case, if I dressed up as Elvis Presley, for example, and I started saying, oh, thank you very much, in that Elvis Presley voice, it would sort of give me permission if I had the big glasses and the sideburns and the jumpsuit on, right? That I wouldn't normally do in my everyday clothes. So it's a permission giving, but it's also related to play, but it is absolutely related to shadow.
Why do you think that whole Halloween tradition is just so watered down from what it used to be? So now it's really just, it feels almost like superficial. It's like fun and candy and trick-or-treating. So what do you think that we just watered down so much on this superficial level?
Again, quick answer to that is that we have lost the sensibility that ritual process is the cultural software that allows us to deal with the archetypal hardware. In other words, true ritual, is the experiential process to allow us to deal with the things going on inside us. And we've lost that connection. So people don't expect, when they do rituals, they don't expect things to happen. They expect fun and games and ceremony, and yeah, it gets watered down. And also, if you're afraid of something, probably the best way to deal with it is to start making fun of it. But I think it's just loss of real true sensibility about ritual process. People have always known about the unconscious. They just called it the other world, and it was unseen, and that's probably where the dead went. Well, yeah, exactly. The loss of meaningful, culturally sanctioned ritual processes, particularly around the transition times of life that are life cycle, like the movement from childhood through puberty into adulthood. We don't do anything with that anymore. That was one of the central rituals and rites of passage of anybody in pre-modern culture. So it's that loss that allows it to just degenerate. As both of you know, one of my favorite movies is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And there's a wonderful scene where the three escaped convicts, two of them have just been baptized and saved. And the very mercurial one is George Clooney. And he's driving the car as they're trying to get away from the law. And they see a black man with a guitar standing on the side of the road. And the dumbest one, Delmar, in the back of the car says, let's pull over and give that man a lift. So they pull over and they get him into the car. And they're driving along and they're introducing themselves. And Delmar says to the black man, he says, say, I haven't seen a house out here for miles. What are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere? And he said, well, I had to be at that crossroads last night to sell my soul to the devil. And George Clooney pops up with his particular mercurial bent. And he said, well, isn't it a strange world, spiritually speaking? Pete and Delmar have just been saved and baptized. I guess I'm the only one that remains unaffiliated. And of course, he's laughing as he's saying this. Delmar in the back is just in shock. He goes, oh, no, son, you sold your everlasting soul just to play a guitar? And Tommy's answer is just so brilliant. It's like, well, I wasn't using it. And that's kind of a take on the modern world. We're not. Soul is what happens after you die. Nobody thinks too much all about it. But at that point, Pete in the front seat, realizing that Tommy has actually seen the devil, speaks up and says, I've always wondered what the devil looks like. And then again, George Clooney butts in with his know-it-all and says, well, Pete, there's all sorts of lesser demons and imps, and man is a creature, but the great Satan himself is red, has scaly skin and a bifurcated tail, and goes around with a hay fork. And Tommy, the black man in the back, speaks up and says, oh, no, no, sir. He's white, just like you people. And if you think about that from a Jungian lens, he's saying the devil's a lot closer to you than some red-scaled hayfork toting dude. And it's built into the story, of course, but that's a brilliant, brilliant film. Much of this, in a medieval person, they would have fear of the red scaly. They had a way of envisioning this. If you bring up the actual archetype of Satan, people look at you like, well, are you stuck in the Middle Ages? There's no such thing as Satan. But if you work in the field of psychology and you see life from that particular lens, I don't know how you could possibly walk away from a career doing that without absolutely, totally convinced that not only is there evil, but that it has agency. I'm not trying to scare anybody here. I'm just saying humans are capable of some very evil things. That's why that, no, sir, he's white like you people comment strikes home, because we're all capable of it. And so it's a great task of becoming a conscious, individuated human to not act that stuff out unconscious. And of course, every once in a while, there's a big outbreak of it. We had numerous ones in the 20th century that absolutely should convince us we ought to be far more scared of the devil or personified evil than any medieval conjurer would have been, because we've now actually developed the technology to pull this stuff off. So it's our inability to symbolize, our inability to relate to the images that is part of the reason why it's degenerated as it has. It would be very wonderful to find out what percentage of costumes are sold, like how many devil costumes are sold. How many people really want to act out that part of themselves, that kind of mischievous, evil part? And so if you go to a cocktail party and you're dressed as the devil, it sort of gives you a certain license. You kind of say things and do things that hopefully people will forgive you after the party.
That was great. Thank you. Is it a wrap?
It's a wrap. We'd love for you to subscribe, give us a like, and share with your friends. Feel free to join us again as we continue to explore the hidden layers of the psyche.
Until next time, may you walk gently with your shadow, and may its wisdom guide you home. And remember, the shadow knows.